podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. Today's episode continues our series on the medieval papacy, from Bishop of Rome to the Papal Monarchy. My co-host is once again my partner for life and my inspiration for all things medieval, my wife, Ellen.
So we're finally going to get to the Papal Monarchy.
Yes, we are.
Let's get into it. You said in the last episode that the Investiture Controversy ended with a compromise with the bishops' two bodies. Their spiritual office belonged to the church. They were to be elected freely by the clergy of the vacant see and invested with the symbols of their spiritual office by the presiding bishop who consecrated them. But as they also held lands and offices from kings, the kings could expect them to do homage for their temporal power and to faithfully fulfill their secular duties. In practice, this gave kings a veto power over the election of a bishop, hence your characterization of it as a compromise. But you also said that the Investiture Controversy laid the foundation for the Papal Monarchy. Okay, can you explain?
The bottom line is that the papacy emerged from the Investiture Controversy as the supreme head of a Roman Catholic Church, superior to all other clergy, including other bishops. As Pope Innocent II declared...
Innocent II?
Yeah. Innocent II, not Innocent III. And I know you were expecting me to say Innocent III. After all, he is the most famous pope with that name and the pope most associated with the Papal Monarchy, which is why this series will conclude with his pontificate. But he was far from the first pope to claim plenary authority over the church.
Gregory VII comes to mind.
Yeah, the Dictatus Papae of Gregory VII is actually pretty over the top in its claims. But the text I was about to quote comes from Pope Innocent II's opening remarks at the Second Lateran Council of 1139. But before I do, I'd like to talk a bit about the historical context of the Second Lateran Council, because it came at the end of a papal schism that had lasted 8 years and pitted against each other two claimants to the Holy See, each of whom regarded himself not only as the rightful pope, but also as the proper heir to the Gregorian reform. It's also a really good story.
I'm up for a good story. As my undergraduate mentor, Professor Suzanne Wempel, said of me, Ellen would have the makings of an historian if only she could overcome her affinity for the anecdotal mode.
I like the anecdotal mode. Okay.
Me too.
For the first 8 years of Innocent II's pontificate, he was contending with an anti-pope, Anacletus II. Unlike other disputed papal elections, this one had less to do with the rivalry between Roman noble families, although both claimants were members of patrician Roman families.
Of course they were.
The issue in 1130 was more ideological. A minority of cardinals, led by the powerful papal chancellor, the Cardinal Emeritus, were committed to a program of internal spiritual reform, much like the Cistercians. The majority of cardinals were more concerned with the issues that underlay the Investiture Controversy, clerical independence from lay control, and in particular, the papacy's resistance to the claims of the emperor. Emeritus sat vigil at the bedside of Pope Honorius II the night that he died. Knowing that his faction was a minority among the cardinals, he concealed news of the pope's death and ordered the pope to be temporarily buried. He then hastily assembled the cardinals he knew to be favorable to reform, and in secret they elected one of their own. And that man took the name Innocent II.
In other words, a coup d'etat.
More accurately, a coup d'église.
Actually, the wonderful South American term autocoup, coup from within, also comes to mind.
Yeah.
I assume the other cardinals didn't just shrug and go along with this.
Of course not. They were outraged. They assembled and held a second election. They unanimously chose Cardinal Pietro di Pierleone, who took the papal name Anacletus II.
Cool. Wait a minute. I remember this. The Pierleoni were a rich Roman family who were descended from a Jewish merchant who had converted.
Yeah. And that was Pietro's great-grandfather Baruch, who took the Christian name Benedict. The Pierleoni were at the time the dominant noble family in the city of Rome, which gave Anacletus II a real advantage.
And his Jewish ancestry wasn't used against him? I mean, of course it was, right?
Yeah, it was. but I'll get to that.
Okay.
Anacletus II's election was held in public and was followed by the customary acclamation of the clergy and laity of the city of Rome. He was quite popular, in fact. Both Innocent II and Anacletus II were consecrated on exactly the same day, the 14th of September.
In separate churches, I hope.
Of course. Anacletus was consecrated in Rome, and Innocent II in the suburban cathedral of the Cardinal Bishop Emerick, his major patron. Because of the support of the citizenry of Rome for Anacletus, Innocent felt it prudent to leave Rome, and he sought support in the court of the King of France.
This must have been while the emperors in Germany were at a low point.
Not quite a low point, but King Lothar of Germany in 1130 wasn't in any position to intervene. He had more pressing concerns closer to home. Lothar, the first king chosen from the Well family, was wrapping up a civil war against the rival Hohenstaufens. In the course of that war, the Hohenstaufens had raised up their own anti-king. And yes, there were German anti-kings in this period along with anti-popes. Okay, what ensued was a propaganda war as Innocent II and Anacletus II sought support from the rulers of Christendom. Anacletus II emphasized that he had been elected with the support of the majority of the cardinals.
I would think that actually following protocol would be a winning argument.
But Innocent II had a secret weapon, the support of the most celebrated holy man in Christendom, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the most dynamic and effective preacher in all of Christendom, and the man most responsible for the success of the Cistercian order. And yes, Anacletus II's Jewish ancestry was used against him in this war of propaganda. As a result, Innocent II obtained recognition from the kings of France, England, and most significantly, from the German king and emperor-elect Lothar. Anacletus, meanwhile, was recognized as pope in Aquitaine, Scotland, Milan, and generally throughout northern Italy, and most importantly, by King Roger II of Sicily. Lothar crossed the Alps with an army to take control of Rome so that he could be consecrated emperor by Pope Innocent II. Anacletus was forced to take refuge behind the walls of Rome's Leonine city.
In other words, the Vatican.
Yes. And then, as now, it was the site of St. Peter's Basilica where emperors were traditionally crowned by popes. So Lothar's coronation took place in the Lateran Basilica. This coronation was later to become the center of yet another papal imperial controversy. Innocent II, citing the donation of Constantine.
Oh, Lord, that again? The mid-8th century forgery concocted by the papal chancery to justify Pepin's establishment of the Papal States? That donation of Constantine?
Yep, that donation of Constantine. And it's arguably the most important forgery of the Middle Ages. But you have to remember, it wasn't until 1440 that the Renaissance humanist Lorenzo Valla demonstrated that it was a forgery, and he did so on linguistic grounds. In 1133, few doubted its authenticity. The donation of Constantine relates that the Emperor Constantine, having been cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, and that was through baptism.
Seriously?
Yeah, seriously. But that seems to have been an early medieval legend that found its way into the donation. At any rate, Constantine showed his gratitude by placing upon the Pope's head a tiara and, quote, holding the bridle of his horse, out of reverence for St. Peter, we performed for him the duty of groom.
Yeah, right.
End quote. In 1133, Innocent II had Lothar follow Emperor Constantine's example.
Purported example.
Lothar held Innocent's stirrups as he mounted his horse and then led the Pope's horse by its bridle to the church. Following that, Lothar knelt before the Pope and kissed his feet.
Lothar must have been really desperate to be crowned emperor. It sounds so humiliating.
It was performative humility. By following this precedent, Lothar was accepting the papal claim to supremacy, at least to spiritual supremacy over all those baptized. It's significant that when Innocent II finally defeated Anacletus, he commissioned a painting of the imperial coronation for his Lateran palace. But we'll talk about that later. And yes, I think Lothar was a bit desperate to get the imperial crown. His own election by the German princes was a break in precedent. When the Emperor Henry V died, his closest kinsman was Duke Frederick of Swabia, the head of the Hohenstaufen family. The German throne had always been elective, but up until then, it was also hereditary. Alienated, however, by Duke Frederick's perceived arrogance, the electors chose instead the head of the rival Welf family, and that was Lothar, Duke of Saxony.
Interesting. But we need to get back to the papacy if it's possible to get to the papacy without involving ourselves in German politics.
Not completely, but
Okay.
we will. Okay, to make a long story short, or at least shorter, Bernard of Clairvaux, supported by a second church reformer, Norbert of Xanten, made a preaching tour urging support for Innocent II. When in 1137, Bernard persuaded both Milan and King Roger II to abandon Anacletus, the game was all but over. The schism finally came to an end in the following year with the death of Anacletus,
Okay.
and Pope Innocent II celebrated the reunification of the church under his stewardship by calling an ecumenical synod the Second Lateran Council of 1139. And that finally brings me back to my original point. In his opening remarks, Pope Innocent II summed up the papal position vis-a-vis the episcopate.
And I assume that the quote is going to be about how the Pope is supreme over all other bishops. Not to be picky, but didn't Anacletus II have the support of a lot of bishops?
He did, and you're making a really good point. Anti-popes are only anti-popes in retrospect.
Okay.
And I think that if there was any justice, Anacletus would not be in italics
Yes.
in papal lists. They couldn't have contested for the Holy See if they hadn't had contemporary support from other bishops.
Or at least an emperor, or both.
Both.
Okay.
There were 10 anti-popes, 10, during the 12th century. Basically, almost always there was an anti-pope. Every dispute over the papacy divided the episcopate as well as the secular rulers of Christendom. But I suspect that many, if not all, of those anti-popes would have agreed with Pope Innocent II when he said, and yes, I am finally getting to the quotation, quote, that Rome is head of the world, that promotion to ecclesiastical dignity is requested from the Roman pontiff, as if by the custom of feudal law, and is not legally held without his permission.
He called it feudal law? I thought feudalism was an invention of historians.
Yeah, maybe the ism is, but feudal law was a reality. By 1139, it was collected, systematized, and codified by northern Italian lawyers in a collection known as the Libri Feodorum. What Pope Innocent II was asserting is that all lesser bishops, which meant every other bishop, held their sees from the papacy, that the Pope stood in relationship to other bishops as a king stood in relationship to his barons, or a feudal lord did to his knights.
All other bishops? How about Constantinople?
Yeah, not until after the Fourth Crusade turned the Byzantine Empire into a second Outremer. But you're right. The Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox churches were in schism. But Pope Innocent II and his successors clearly believed that the Eastern Orthodox bishops ought also to be subject to Rome.
So you're not saying that the investiture controversy ended lay influence over the selection of bishops.
It didn't. Kings continued to have a say in the matter, and many times it was the dominant say. The Concordat of Worms of 1122 that ended the investiture controversy specified that the emperor had the right to be present at episcopal elections so that if a dispute arose, he could, with the council of the metropolitan and other bishops, give, quote, his consent and aid to the party which had the more right, end quote. The kings of England and France enjoyed similar papal privileges.
That's getting very close to granting kings the right to appoint their favored candidates as bishops. It would take courageous canons to refuse to elect a candidate named by a king in the presence of the king. Isn't that how Henry II got his Chancellor Thomas Becket elected Archbishop of Canterbury, despite the objections of other bishops and the reluctance of the monks?
It was, and I recommend that our listeners, if they haven't listened to it, go back and listen to the episodes on Thomas Becket.
Okay.
But your point is well taken. I'd also, however, note that Henry II, when he got buyer's remorse, couldn't simply get rid of Archbishop Thomas Becket. He could expel him from England and prevent him from returning, but he could not depose him and name a new archbishop. That power was solely in the hands of the Pope. Popes also could overturn the decisions of kings in disputed elections if the unsuccessful claimant appealed to the Holy See. But unless an election was appealed to the papacy or a bishop-elect died in Rome, in which case the Pope could name his replacement, popes tended not to get involved.
Okay, can you give me an example of a disputed election and an appeal to the papacy?
Can I? I have a real doozy for you. This is one of my favorite stories about medieval episcopal elections.
You have favorite stories about elections of bishops?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not ashamed to admit I am a medieval nerd.
Okay.
So are you, though.
Not that much.
Not that much. Okay, but on to the story. It concerns the election of a bishop of Liège in 1191, 7 years before Innocent III became pope. Liège is now a city in Belgium. In the Middle Ages, it belonged to the Holy Roman Empire, though it was on the northwestern fringe, which was a region given to revolt. The Bishop of Liège was what was called an imperial prince-bishop. Emperor Otto II in 975 had delegated regalian rights over the county of Huy to the bishops of Liège, which made them princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The diocese of Liège included lands belonging to the Duchy of Brabant and the county of Hainaut. The Duke of Brabant and the Count of Hainaut were often at odds with one another, if not at war, and so they had a stake in who was to hold the see of Liège. This came into play in the episcopal election of 1191. The two candidates for the see were Albert of Louvain, the archdeacon of St. Lambert's Cathedral, and Albert of Rethel, its provost. Both were members of the highest nobility. Albert of Louvain was brother of Duke Henry I of Brabant, while Albert of Rethel was a cousin of Count Baldwin V of Hainaut.
Okay, two Alberts. This is getting confusing.
Before we're done, there will be 3 Alberts.
Oh, Lord.
The story's pretty complicated with a number of twists, but please hang in there. It will become clear in the end. At least I hope it will be clear by the end. Okay, so the canons of the cathedral met, and a majority of them chose Albert of Louvain. Count Baldwin V of Hainaut, however, refused to recognize the election. He held a second election in which only the canons who had voted for Albert of Rethel were present. They, of course, elected him.
Okay, so we have 2 bishops elect. Did it go to the Pope?
Not yet.
Okay.
Remember I said that the Concordat of Worms had granted to German kings the right to be present and to decide disputed elections? The Emperor Lothar III had allowed this to slide for a couple of episcopal elections, but Henry VI held a tighter rein upon royal prerogatives. The Prince Bishop of Liège was too important a position to be filled by just anyone. In 1191, the Emperor Henry VI was planning a military campaign to assert his wife's claim to the throne of Sicily. An earlier Sicilian campaign had failed because of rebellions in Germany. A loyal and competent Prince Bishop of Liège would help ensure political stability in the northwestern frontier of the empire. The emperor regarded the disputed election as a godsend. It allowed him to appoint his own preferred candidate to the see. That was a man by the name of Lothar of Hochstatten. Lothar had been dean of St. Lambert's Cathedral in Liège, so he was not a completely unreasonable choice. But what made him the right man for the job, at least for the emperor, was that he was also the imperial arch-chancellor. To ensure the compliance of the canons, Henry VI accompanied Lothar to Liège and sat beside him in the chapter house during the election, as was his right. Albert of Rethel was present at the election as well. Albert of Louvain, suspecting that Henry VI was going to do something that was not to his benefit, had instead gone to Reims to seek support for his election from the Archbishop of Reims. The Archbishop of Reims was the metropolitan bishop with oversight over the see of Liège.
Let me guess, the canons elected Lothar.
Mirabile dictu, they did.
Okay, that must have made both Alberts unhappy.
They weren't thrilled. Albert of Rethel was actually the uncle of Henry VI's wife, Constance. The emperor must have felt somewhat abashed about his turning his back on a kinsman, so he assuaged his guilt by offering a cash settlement for Albert to relinquish his claim.
Simony in reverse?
Yeah, it sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In any case, Albert of Rethel refused the money but accepted the election as a fait accompli. He made a formal submission to Bishop Lothar and remained loyal to him in its dispute with the other Albert.
And the other Albert, of Louvain had to have been even unhappier. At least he had been elected by a majority of the canons.
He had been, and he was. Albert of Louvain was unwilling to renounce his claim to the bishopric. Henry VI could have, but apparently didn't, cite a deficiency in Albert's candidacy. The canonical age requirement for bishops was to be at least 30 years old. Albert, at the time of his election, was only 25.
Considering we had teenage popes.
I know. But the age qualification was regularly overlooked in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, and the election of the pious Albert was regarded favorably by both the clergy of Liège and by the neighboring bishops, most critically, of course, his metropolitan, Archbishop William of Rheims. With the support of Archbishop William, Albert of Louvain appealed to Pope Celestine III in Rome.
Now, the Concord of Worms required a king to consult the metropolitan bishop when deciding disputed elections. I gather Henry VI hadn't bothered. Did it really matter?
In this particular case, it did. William of the White Hands.
What?
Yeah, William of the White Hands. I know it sounds like something out of Tolkien, but that's how he was known.
Yep.
Guillaume au Blanche Main. He wasn't only Archbishop of Rheims, which in itself was an extremely important position, but he was also a cardinal priest and a longtime member of the papal curia. His support weighed heavily in Albert's favor with the Pope. Pope Celestine III not only recognized the validity of Albert of Louvain's election, but tied him directly to the papacy by appointing him as a cardinal deacon.
So to try to contest Albert's status as bishop-elect was to question the primacy of the Pope.
Exactly. After spending the summer in Rome, Albert of Louvain returned to Rheims. With the Pope's blessings and approval, Archbishop William consecrated him Bishop of Liège on September the 19th, 1192.
So, did that end it, and everybody accepted Albert of Louvain as bishop, demonstrating your point about the growing power of the papacy? Okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. Alas, no. The newly consecrated bishop was met by 3 German knights who offered to escort him to Liège. When they had ridden a ways outside of the city of Rheims, the 3 knights suddenly unsheathed their swords and struck the bishop down.
Wow. Okay, did that leave Lothar as bishop?
Briefly. Despite Lothar swearing an oath as to his innocence, everyone seems to have believed that he was behind the murder.
Okay, on the principle of cui bono, but it could also have been Count Baldwin V. After all, he was a secular ruler, and the killers were knights. But how did Pope Celestine react?
By excommunicating Lothar and negating his election. But Lothar had more immediate problems. The murder provoked the outrage not only of the papal curia, but closer to home, of the townspeople of Liège. Because of his reputation for piety and the manner of his death, the slain bishop was soon regarded as a martyr, although it took another 420 years for the church to officially recognize him as a saint. And yes, Albert of Louvain is a saint. Meanwhile, Lothar had gone to Liège to take possession of his see. The word in the street in Liège was that Lothar had either contracted the hit or at the very least was complicit in it. Fearing the rising hostility of the townspeople, Lothar fled the city. He sought refuge in the court of his brother, Count Dietrich of Hochstatten.
Okay, I can see where this could be going. You started by saying Albert of Louvain was the younger brother of Duke Henry I of Brabant. Okay, so medieval aristocratic culture operated on the principle of reciprocity. Gift-giving is one side of the coin. Are we getting to the blood feud on the other?
Exactly. Duke Henry I and his nephew, the Duke of Limburg, raised forces to avenge their murdered kinsmen. With the support of the archbishops of Mainz and Cologne.
Wait a minute. I take it you mean the military support of the archbishops, not just their thoughts and prayers.
Exactly. The military support of those prince archbishops. The 2 dukes ravaged the county of Hochstaden. So Lothar prudently fled to Rome for safety.
To the Pope who had just excommunicated him?
Yep. To
Okay.
Pope Celestine III. Only the Pope could lift that excommunication and clear him of his presumed guilt. He made submission to the Pope and swore before him a second oath declaring his innocence. Celestine III lifted Lothar's excommunication. Lothar, in return, renounced his claim to the see of Liège.
So we started with 3 clerics claiming to be bishop. Now we're down to 0. Okay, who else stepped in now?
After a vacancy of a few months, the son of Duke Henry III of Limburg, a 16-year-old named Simon, was elected by the canons of Liège, and soon after this was invested as the Prince Bishop of Liège by the Emperor Henry VI.
16? How did that go over?
Not well, but it wasn't about his age. It was about who he was. It didn't go over at all well with Count Baldwin V of Hainaut and the supporters of Lothar. They now appealed the election to the Holy See.
Celestine III must have been tired of all this, so what happened now?
The Pope ordered an investigation into the election, and he found irregularities.
No.
Yep. He ordered a new election, and this time the canons chose another Albert. I told you there'd be 3 Alberts. This is Albert of Cook. He was the provost of the monastery of St. Paul in Liège.
Did they all live happily ever after?
Hardly. Simon refused to step down from the bishopric, and Baldwin V of Hainaut besieged him in his castle of Huy. Simon appealed to his father and to Duke Henry I of Brabant for military support. The 2 sides finally agreed to take the matter back to the Pope.
Oh, boy.
With the wisdom of Solomon, Pope Celestine III granted Simon the rank of cardinal and confirmed Albert of Cook as Bishop of Liège. It helped that Simon died while in Rome. I know he was a young man, but young men can catch malaria.
And that didn't settle it?
No. Yeah. Upon learning of Simon's death, the canons of St. Lambert elected their archdeacon, Otto of Falkenberg, as bishop. Both Albert and Otto sought confirmation from Emperor Henry VI. When the emperor learned of the Pope's choice, he gave the regalia to Albert. Otto accepted the emperor's and the Pope's decision. This happened in 1195, so it only took 4 years to settle the matter.
Wow. So, by the end of the 12th century, popes did have the ultimate say on disputed episcopal elections, which carried a lot of political ramifications. From what you have said, Celestine III's ability to intervene so often in this episcopal dispute is a consequence of the Investiture Controversy, right?
It was. The Investiture Controversy produced significant changes in the episcopate's relationship with the papacy. In the early 11th century, the papacy claimed primacy over all other bishops, but that primacy was more theoretical than real. Those bishops were more directly answerable to the kings and counts to whom they owed their sees. By the end of the 12th century, the episcopate had come firmly under the jurisdiction of the papacy. Popes could discipline, depose, transfer, and under certain conditions, appoint bishops. They had the right to nominate an alternative candidate in the case of disputed elections that came before them, and they could name a successor to a bishop or an archbishop who died while in Rome or on his way to Rome. That nominee would then be canonically elected by the clergy of the see,
if they knew it was good for them. This sounds not much different from kings nominating candidates for vacancies in their realms. But all of this could sometimes result in a bishop or archbishop that the king didn't want.
Which is what happened in the case of Stephen Langton, whom Innocent III, as we'll see, chose as Archbishop of Canterbury, much against the wishes of King John of England. The papacy's supremacy over other bishops grew throughout the 13th century. In the 11th century, archbishops-elect were expected to travel to Rome to be consecrated by the Pope. In the 13th century, popes claimed the sole right to consecrate bishops. This was perhaps because of financial needs.
So much for financial reform.
In earlier centuries, newly consecrated archbishops were expected to pay what was called an oblatio, an offering to the Pope, which was a money offering of thanks for the consecration. When the papacy established itself as the sole authority to consecrate bishops, this offering became institutionalized as what was called an annate, 1 year's profit from the see that the bishop was entering into.
We're getting back to simony.
I'm sure that some clerical reformers saw it that way, but most accepted it as a necessary mechanism to pay for the ever-growing cost of the papal bureaucracy.
And how did kings react to this?
In the 13th century, popes granted kings at least kings that they favored, the privilege of nominating bishops. Kings retained the ability to withhold from a bishop the lands that the see held from the crown and the delegated jurisdiction from the crown. So kings were really cut out entirely from the selection of bishops. Regardless, 12th and 13th century popes expected a bishop's ultimate loyalty and obedience to be reserved to the papacy. In practice, this was not always the case, but it was at least the expectation. The personnel of the episcopacy also changed. In the early Middle Ages, bishops, with few exceptions, were the sons of kings, counts, and other magnates. Now the free election of bishops by canons of the cathedral sometimes led to men of lesser nobility and wealth rising up through the ranks of the church to its highest offices, although we didn't see that in Liège.
No. So, by empowering the papacy and assuring its domination over the clergy, the Investiture Controversy promoted the emergence of an institutionalized Roman Catholic Church.
And that church looked a lot like a supranational monarchy with a bureaucracy that was the envy of every other ruler.
Okay, how?
One practical result of the papal reform was the growth of papal government and business, and this meant the growth of papal bureaucracy. The primary function of medieval rulers was organizing justice and pronouncing judgment. This was also to be true of the papacy. The 12th century initiates an age of intense ecclesiastical litigation, with papal courts, whether presided over by legates or in Rome itself, being the ultimate source of judgment. The legates served as itinerating justices. The Roman Synod served as a supreme court for the church, as well as a council for the pope in which business was conducted.
If there were courts, the church also had to have laws to guide the outcome of disputes. I assume that canon law or regulation was systematized around this time.
Yes, spoken like a true lawyer.
Well, thank you.
Yes, and it was systematized in a work known as Gratian's Decretum. Around the year 1140, an Italian canon lawyer, the cleric was named Gratian, composed a legal textbook modeled on the Roman Corpus Juris Civilis, Roman law, to aid in the practical application of existing canon law.
Okay. I understand how the papacy now controls bishops and archbishops. What was the Pope's relationship to lesser clergy?
Bishops remained largely responsible for the parish clergy within their diocese, but the papacy systematized and ordered church organization. If a bishop was unable or unwilling to do so, they protected parish priests from eviction. The papacy presided over church councils that guaranteed parish priests a minimum income, defined and enforced clerical discipline, defined religious duties, guaranteed the sanctity of wills and testaments, and guided lay moral behavior. It also eventually required that these parish priests become educated enough to be able to read Latin and to perform the liturgy properly.
Okay, but when you say lay moral behavior, what does that cover?
Much of that had to do with marriage. As a sacrament, the institution of marriage was overseen by the clergy and ultimately by the papacy.
So we have a celibate clergy acting as arbiters of marital disputes, okay? I assume we're talking about ecumenical church councils. How many were there during the Papal Monarchy?
Between the year 650 and the year 1000, there were only 3 ecumenical councils, 2 of them held in Constantinople and 1 in Nicaea, all in the East. Between 1123 and 1274, there were 6 ecumenical councils, all in the West. In addition, there was an explosion of local legatine councils. That's councils presided over by a papal legate. And in England alone, there were 20 such councils between the year 1050 and the year 1300.
So I assume there was also an increase in promulgation of papal letters. After all, wouldn't there have to be some sort of written mechanism for ordering things done or decided?
Yeah, the papal bureaucracy especially excelled at record keeping.
As an historian, you have to be
I
glad.
love it. I love it. I mean,
Okay.
we can actually know things because of this.
Okay.
By the middle of the 13th century, the Apostolic Chancery drafted and archived hundreds of papal letters each year. This was done by a small army of papal notaries. Senior notaries oversaw the drafts of formal papal bulls, which dealt with doctrinal issues, and with correspondences with kings, legates, and bishops. Lesser notaries drafted the ordinary letters arising from the myriad legal disputes that flooded into the Roman Curia. Abbreviators were responsible for producing rough drafts of both papal bulls and letters. These drafts were then turned into clean copies by scriptors. Because accuracy was critical, those copies were then checked for errors by correctors, sort of medieval versions of spell check and Microsoft Editor. If errors were discovered, the copy was returned to the scriptor for correction. Just as critically, the apostolic chancery included computators. These were officials responsible for setting and collecting fees from the petitioners. The apostolic chancery brought in substantial revenues. Now, papal bulls were very similar to royal edicts, and papal letters were a bit like royal writs. Papal letters were the most important instrument for the conduct of ecclesiastical business. They were the mechanisms for the Pope conveying orders, resolving disputes, issuing decisions on doctrine. Here we see a steady increase in the issuance of letters over the course of the High Middle Ages. In the first half of the 11th century, popes issued an average of 1 to 10 letters a year. And all of that changed in the 12th century with the growth of papal business.
Okay, do we have numbers for that?
Yeah, we do. And they were collected by the great historian, Sir Richard Southern. According to Southern, the popes in the first half of the 11th century issued, as I said, between only 1 and 10 letters a year. Under Leo IX, that rose to 35 a year and stayed at this level until around 1130. Pope Innocent II, who was pope from 1130 to 1143, issued 72 letters every year. Hadrian IV, pope from 1154 to 1159, issued 130. His successor, Alexander III, 179, and Innocent III, 280 letters a year. And that actually is only a third of the number of letters issued by the papal curia annually in the middle of the 13th century.
Wow. That's pretty good evidence for the growing importance of the Pope, and I assume that a lot of these dealt with legal matters?
They did. In fact, a lot of them dealt with even things like marriage. The 12th century was a period of litigation, litigation both secular and ecclesiastical. Between 1140 and 1150, papal jurisdiction began to penetrate even the lowest levels of the church as a matter of routine. By 1150, the papal courts were overwhelmed with business. If two monasteries had a dispute over even a few acres of land, that could end up in Rome. Popes complained about the press of business. Pope Callistus II, pope from 1119 to 1124, commented that as Bishop of Vienne, everyone of note in his see was either a kinsman, a neighbor, or a vassal. Now, as pope, he found the glory of the papacy, quote, a misery and a tribulation. When I am in Rome, I have as many lords as I have cardinals and as many masters as I have citizens, end quote.
So you're saying that that potential popes, when they said, I don't want to be pope, they might actually have meant it?
No, they didn't. They didn't.
Okay.
St. Bernard of Clairvaux in 1150 warned his protege, the very holy, the very devout Cistercian Eugenius III, about allowing, quote, the pressure of business to waste his time. It's little wonder that from the pontificate of Alexander III, who became pope in 1159, from that time on, popes tended to be chosen from among canon lawyers rather than from monks, as they had been during the first half of the Gregorian Reform.
Speaking as a lawyer, that can't be good.
Oh, come on. Lawyers are great. I married one.
Okay.
But that might explain why between the years 1050 and 1300, only 3 popes became saints. Leo IX, Gregory VII, and Celestine V, none of whom were canon lawyers.
Wow.
The papacy became the final arbiter for all disputes between ecclesiastical bodies or persons or between clerics and laity and over property rights and penalties. To deal with the influx of business, the popes began to create ad hoc committees of 3 local churchmen to hear and decide with the authority of the papacy. Still, cases flowed to Rome as the decisions of those local committees were appealed to Rome. There's one case, which I really like, in which there was a dispute that involved less than £10 a year, and that particular dispute ended up producing numerous hearings and dozens of letters from and to the Pope. Every step of the process required the payment of money or gifts or promises of future goodies, and that was needed to secure the favor of the judges and the patrons.
Ah, such reform. And that brings us back to an irony you pointed out in the last episode, that the reformed papacy ended up as a target of clerical reformers. Having to pour out cash to smooth legal waters must have produced cynicism. And I still remember reading as an undergraduate a mid-12th century satire called The Gospel According to the Mark of Silver, in which the Pope and his cardinals, in a parody of biblical language, fleece the suitors who come to them.
Yeah, it's a wonderful text, and I just so happen to have it here. So why don't you do the honors and read?
Okay. At that time, the Pope said to the Romans, "When the Son of Man comes to the seat of your majesty, first say, 'Friend, why have you come?' But if he continues knocking without giving you anything, throw him out into the outer darkness." And it came to pass that a certain poor cleric came to the curia of the Lord Pope and cried out, saying, "Do you at least have mercy on me, you doorkeepers of the Pope, for the hand of poverty has touched me. I am indeed needy and poor, therefore I beg you to come to my aid." But when they heard him, they were exceedingly angry, and they said, "Friend, you and your poverty can go to hell. Get thou behind me, Satan, because you do not smell of money. Amen, amen, I say to you, you shall not enter into the joy of your Lord the Pope until you pay your last farthing." So the poor man went away and sold his coat and his shirt and everything he owned and gave it to the cardinals and doorkeepers and chamberlain. But they said, "What is this among so many?" They threw him out, and he went off weeping bitterly and inconsolably. Later on, a certain rich cleric came to the curia. He was gross and fat and swollen, and had committed treacherous murder. He bribed first the doorkeeper, then the chancellor, then the cardinals. But they put their heads together and demanded more. However, the Lord Pope heard that his cardinals and ministers had been lavishly bribed by the cleric, and he was sick unto death. So the rich man sent him medicine in the form of gold and silver, and straightway he was healed. The Lord Pope summoned his cardinals and ministers and said to them, "Brethren, be vigilant lest anyone deceive you with empty words. My example I give unto you, that you might grab just as I grab." Now, the cynicism of this anonymous cleric is palpable. Quote, "Blessed are the rich, for they shall be filled. Blessed are they who have, for they shall not go away empty. Blessed are the wealthy, for theirs is the court of Rome." The martyrs who mattered, according to these critics, were Albinus and Rufinus, pale silver and red gold.
These were characters who first appeared during the pontificate of Gregory VII. Contrast this with the 10th century pilgrim hymn, O Roma Nobilis, which was written during the nadir of the papacy. O noble Rome, mistress of the world, most excellent of all cities, stained red with the ruby blood of martyrs, decorated with the white lilies of virgins. For all we salute you, we bless you, hail you for all ages. If you do, the irony is overwhelming. The Reformed papacy had lost the prestige enjoyed by the secular popes of the 10th century. Even the Blessed Eugenius III, a Cistercian monk, was to be condemned as a man of blood by the radical reformer and papal critic Arnold of Brescia, who led a Roman communal movement reminiscent of the Milanese Paterini. The Paterini, who had been formerly allies of the Reformed papacy, had become heretics. And Albert of Brescia's criticism of clerical morals and his repudiation of the temporal power of prelates was almost like a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation.
But meanwhile, the papal supremacy over the episcopate was firmly established. What happened to Pope Gregory VII's claim of supremacy and oversight over Christian kings?
That was far from settled, and it wasn't to be settled during the Middle Ages. The extent to which kings were subject to papal supervision, or for that matter, popes and bishops to the authority of kings, was disputed, sometimes violently, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries.
Okay. Innocent III is probably most famous for launching 3 crusades and for his ability to compel kings to do his bidding. Both of these are key to the idea of his pontificate being the apex of the papal monarchy. As you said, the investiture controversy hadn't really resolved the relationship between popes and kings. Gregory VII's claim that popes could judge and depose kings, unsurprisingly, didn't go over big with kings. The Reformed papacy equally rejected theocratic claims to royal authority over the church and churchmen. So how does Innocent III get involved in this?
Yeah, and Innocent III is going to be our exemplar of the apex of the papal monarchy. But before we get to Innocent III, I think I'm going to mention a few earlier popes.
Okay.
Pope Hadrian IV, Pope Alexander III, and Pope Urban III.
Was Hadrian IV Nicholas Breakspere, the first and only English pope?
Yes, the
Cool.
very same. Now, these popes came into direct conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. What Pope Innocent III was to the papal monarchy, Frederick I Barbarossa was to the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, as we're going to see, he is the man responsible for the adjective holy being added to Roman Empire.
Okay.
In 1152, Frederick wrote to Pope Eugenius III informing him of his election to the imperial office. In it, he explained to the Pope his intention, quote, to restore with God's help the majesty of the Roman Empire to its original strength and its original excellence, end quote.
Okay.
Hadrian IV was strong-willed and determined to assert the plenary authority of the papacy over the clergy and the laity. Frederick was equally strong-willed and determined to rule Italy with the power and authority of a Roman emperor, which meant also ruling the papal states.
This isn't going to end well, is it?
No. At the beginning of his pontificate in 1154, Hadrian required military assistance from Frederick, who was then just king of Germany, but he was also emperor-elect. The city of Rome was under the control of a Republican commune led by that renegade cleric, Arnold de Brescia, who, by the way, was a student of Abelard.
Really?
Yeah. And Arnold de Brescia had been declared a heretic by the papacy. The papal states, meanwhile, were threatened on the southern frontier by the Norman ruler of Sicily, King William I. Fortunately, Hadrian had inherited from his predecessor, Pope Eugenius III, a treaty with Frederick. This treaty, the Treaty of Constance, was a mutual aid pact against the Roman commune, King William I of Sicily, and the Byzantine emperor, who was then preparing an invasion to recover Sicily and southern Italy to the Byzantine Empire.
Oh, boy.
Frederick, who was king of Germany and emperor-elect for his part, needed a pope to crown him emperor. He also had his eye on restoring Roman imperial rule over southern Italy. The Treaty of Constance specified that Frederick's coronation as emperor was contingent upon the expulsion of Arnold of Brescia from Rome. Between Frederick's muscle and Hadrian's imposition of an interdict on Rome, and an interdict, to just explain, is basically, an interdict is essentially an ecclesiastical shutdown. All religious services are suspended. Priests and deacons are prohibited from administering the sacraments, except for those deemed necessary for salvation, which in the 12th century were infant baptism and absolution for the dying, and there were to be no burials in consecrated ground. An interdict was the papacy's nuclear weapon. Pope Hadrian made it clear that lifting the interdict was contingent upon the expulsion of Arnold of Brescia from Rome. So that is exactly what the Senate of the Commune did. So Arnold fled from Rome, and when he fled from Rome, he was captured by Frederick's forces. They returned him to Rome, and there he was tried by the Roman Curia as a rebel. He was convicted, and he was hanged.
Wait a minute. A rebel against the Pope. I thought he was a heretic.
He was, but he was convicted of treason against the Lord of the Papal States and the Lord of Rome, the Pope, rather than heresy at this trial. The decision was to burn his body after he was taken down from the gallows and to scatter his ashes over the Tiber River. And guess why? Why would you do that? Why would you?
It's the same as with Joan of Arc. You don't want to have any relics, and you don't want his burial site to become a center for pilgrims.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
But from what you're saying, I gather this partnership between Barbarossa and Pope Hadrian was only temporary.
it almost immediately began to unravel. It was clear from the outset that Frederick's conception of the imperial office and Hadrian's of the papacy were in direct conflict. How much they conflicted became clear at Frederick's imperial coronation. The Pope and Emperor met at Sutri, a town which is about 30 miles northwest of Rome. The two were going to then journey together to Rome, where the consecration was to take place. Pope Hadrian greeted Frederick and explained that protocol required him to play the part of the Pope's groom, holding his stirrups as he mounted and then leading his horse by his bridle to the church, where he would then kneel before the Pope and kiss his feet. The Pope would then give the Emperor-elect a kiss of peace.
This would be a cold day in hell when Barbarossa would do that. Anyway, but I remember that from Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae, quote, all princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone, close quote. I mean, I can't believe that was ever meant to be taken seriously or literally. I mean, it seems demeaning, and it places the king below the Pope.
That is precisely how Pope Innocent II had seen it 22 years earlier, when he had required the Emperor Lothar to follow that exact protocol. As I mentioned earlier, Innocent II commissioned a painting for the Lateran showing Emperor Lothar leading his horse and kissing his feet. Now, the inscription that was under that painting read, Homo fit papae. Thus, he becomes the Pope's man.
In other words, his vessel. Did Barbarossa know about this painting?
He did. And that may have been the reason why he refused to help the Pope mount. He refused to lead his horse by the bridle. And because of this violation of protocol, Pope Hadrian refused to give Frederick the kiss of peace. Emperor and Pope parted on bad terms. Had Frederick, we are told, discussed the matter with his advisors, who assured him that this was simply a matter of protocol and didn't define his relationship to the Pope as a vassal. Frederick was pragmatic, and he realized that he was not going to get crowned as emperor unless he followed the protocol. And so on the next day, he actually kissed the Pope's feet. As he did this, he is supposed to have muttered, I do this for Peter, not for Hadrian.
Okay.
And the Pope gave him the kiss of peace, which set the stage for the imperial coronation. Neither the German king nor the English Pope was popular with the townspeople of Rome, and they responded to the consecration of the emperor with a riot that was forcibly and bloodily put down by German troops.
And it still didn't resolve the underlying issue of authority and status.
Worse than that, Frederick almost immediately broke his pledge to honor the Treaty of Constance, and the Treaty of Constance said that he was to give the Pope military support against King William of Sicily. The Pope was preparing a military expedition. He expected that Barbarossa and his troops would lead this expedition, but at that point, Frederick received news of yet another rebellion, and that forced him to return to Germany. Pope Hadrian, at this point, saw no option but to make peace individually with William. He negotiated with the Norman ruler. The Pope gave his blessing to William's status as king. He recognized his rule over Sicily and all of southern Italy, and granted him special rights over the Sicilian church. In return, King William acknowledged the Pope as his feudal overlord and promised to pay the papacy a large annual fee in recognition of the Pope's overlordship. This treaty secured the southern frontier of the Papal State against Norman aggression, but you know what Frederick saw it as? Treachery, treason, a betrayal of the Treaty of Constance.
Okay. How can it be treason unless, he thinks the Pope...
Yes.
Never mind.
In 1157, Frederick called an imperial diet, and that's simply an assembly of all of the princes, both secular and ecclesiastical of Germany, an imperial diet to meet in the city of Besançon to discuss the situation. Pope Hadrian did not attend in person, but he sent a delegation from Rome that presented Frederick with a letter explaining the Pope's position and expressing some grievances that the Pope had. Frederick asked his most trusted advisor, his chancellor, Archbishop Reynold of Dassel, to translate the Latin letter to German and read it aloud to everybody gathered. This is what the letter said, quote, "We have always loved your person as that of our most dear and special son, the most Christian prince, whose power we do not doubt to have been founded by the grace of God on the rock of the apostolic confession. And we have treated you always with the partiality of due kindness. For you should, O most glorious Son, bring before the eyes of your mind how graciously and how joyfully your mother, the Holy Roman Church, received you in a former year, with what affection of heart she has treated you, what plenitude of dignity and honor she has granted you, and how most willingly conferring upon you the distinction of the imperial crown. Nor do we repent, having fulfilled in all things the desires of your heart, but would rejoice if your excellency had received from our hand even greater benefices." The word is beneficia in Latin. "If that were possible, knowing as we do what great increase in advantage can come through you to the Church of God and to us," end quote.
Wow. Okay, that's a problem. Frederick didn't acknowledge that the imperial office was a gift conferred on him by the Pope. He claimed he was emperor by election through the grace of God, and the Pope was just acting as God's instrument by consecrating him.
And that is exactly what Frederick pointed out in his response to the Pope, which was probably drafted by Reynold.
Yeah.
Now, what was even worse was Reynold, who had a clear sense of imperial dignity and was no fan of the papacy. Reynold chose to translate the letter in German to emphasize the feudal implications of the Latin word beneficia. He made it clear that what the Pope was saying was that the beneficia, which could mean simply benefit, actually meant fief.
Well, yeah, benefice.
Yeah.
Okay.
The implication was that the Pope was claiming that Frederick only held the empire as a fief from the Pope. Frederick's anger comes out clearly in the letter that he sent to Hadrian in response. Quote, "Your legates, as if inflated with the mammon of unrighteousness, out of the height of their pride, from the summit of their arrogance, in the execrable elation of their swelling hearts, did present to us a message in the form of an apostolic letter, the tenor of which was that we should always keep it before our mind's eye how the Lord Pope had conferred upon us the distinction of the imperial crown, and that he would not regret it if our Highness were to receive from him even greater benefices. Of a sad truth at that word, blasphemous and devoid of all truth, benefices. Not only did the imperial majesty conceive a righteous indignation, but all the princes who were present were filled with such fury and wrath that without doubt they would have condemned those two unhallowed priests, representing the papacy, to the punishment of death had not our presence, since many similar letters, prevented them."
Don't hold back. Tell us what you really think. Did war follow?
Not immediately. Both Pope and Emperor backtracked and tried to patch things up, at least for a year. What caused the final breach was Frederick's assertion at another diet, and that was in the year 1158, his claim to imperial rule over all of northern Italy, including the Papal States.
Oh, boy.
Frederick was serious about restoring the Roman Empire to its original strength, and that meant directly ruling Rome. People like Reynold of Dassel were Roman lawyers. This was a period which saw the rediscovery of the Justinian Code and of Roman law, and it was being studied in universities. And these university-educated advisors to the kings
We're not helping the situation.
Well, they were trying to help the king. They weren't helping the situation when it came to the relationship between the crown and the papacy.
Okay.
So, the Pope couldn't accept this, of course.
But you also said that Frederick also wanted other German bishops to recognize Charlemagne as a saint?
Yeah. This was part of a propaganda war. The emperor and the Pope publicly denounced one another in a series of proclamations and letters. This was when the Roman Empire became, for the very first time, the Holy Roman Empire, as Frederick, or at least his Chancellor Reinald, began adding that adjective sacrum, holy, to imperium. Most importantly, however, he and the German bishops declared Hadrian deposed and replaced him with an anti-pope, Victor IV, and Victor IV was the first of 3 anti-popes.
So much for papal control of bishops. But didn't Barbarossa lose in the end?
He did, but crucially, his defeat was not because of papal threats or papal excommunication or interdict. He was excommunicated, but that's not what defeated him. He was defeated militarily. Frederick's goal of direct rule over northern Italy threatened not only the independence of the Papal States, but even more critically, it threatened the self-governance of the republics and duchies of Lombardy and Tuscany. These city-states made common cause with the papacy. The papacy won out because the Italian Lombard League decisively defeated Frederick's German forces in the Battle of Legnano in 1176. Ironically, this alliance did not include the city of Rome.
Wait a minute. I thought you said that Pope Hadrian IV regained control of Rome after Arnold of Brescia was executed in 1155.
He did, but it was only temporary. From 1143 on, the city of Rome was actually a republic.
You mean like on the model of Venice?
More on the model of ancient Rome. The Roman Commune reestablished a Roman Senate. The revival of Roman law in the universities of Italy in the late 11th and 12th centuries provided ammunition and justifications for both emperors, such as Frederick Barbarossa, as well as for Italian communes seeking self-governance. That came at the expense of dukes and bishops.
Okay, I can see where this is going. The Pope, as Bishop of Rome, claimed to be the secular ruler of the city.
Yep.
Okay.
And the Roman Commune took away the Pope's rights to mint coins, to tax, and to exercise secular jurisdiction. The irony is that 12th century popes were able to exercise more power over the papal states than they could over the city of Rome itself.
Okay.
To be clear, this doesn't mean that the Roman Commune supported Barbarossa. They were equally opposed to his claim to imperial rule over them. They were looking for independence. As a result, the Roman Commune remained neutral when the Lombard city-states allied with Pope Alexander III against the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa.
You mean a plague on both their houses?
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting sidetracked again. You left off with Pope Alexander III making an alliance with the cities of Lombardy against Barbarossa. How did that turn out for the papacy?
It turned out really well.
It did?
It did. Now, we tend to exaggerate the military effectiveness of medieval knights, and you hear Frederick Barbarossa and you think, wow, he's the leader of all of these feudal knights or whatever. Yeah. And actually, the Lombard League's well-trained and armed citizen militias, supported by cavalry supplied by the Italian nobility, were much more effective, and they decisively defeated Frederick's forces in the Battle of Legnano in 1176. This ended Barbarossa's attempt to impose direct imperial rule over northern Italy. In 1177, Frederick made peace with the papacy. By the terms of the Peace of Venice, Frederick recognized Pope Alexander III as pope and abandoned the last of his 3 anti-popes. He also recognized the pope's temporal rights over the papal states. Pope Alexander III, for his part, lifted Frederick's excommunication.
So tell me, did they live happily ever after, or at least briefly happily?
Relations remained fairly harmonious for the remainder of Frederick's reign, except for the brief pontificate of Urban III, which was from 1185 to 1187. I said brief. The cardinals regarded Urban III's predecessor, Lucius III, as being much too deferential to Frederick, so they opted for someone whom they believed would stand up more firmly for papal rights. Well, they got it. They got more than they expected in Urban III. Now, the problem was, Urban III wasn't Roman. He came from Milan, and from an important family in Milan, and the Milanese had real personal grievances against Frederick. In 1162, Frederick Barbarossa had brutally put down a second revolt by the Milanese. The city was too large to raze to the ground, so he did the next best thing. He had its gates and its bell tower pulled down and ordered its leading citizens to come before him with their heads covered in ashes and ropes around their necks to surrender the keys to the city and to turn over their swords and their banners.
This seems to be an established medieval ritual of humiliation.
It was. Symbolism and ritual were all important in the Middle Ages. Urban III remembered how his family had been shamed by the emperor. The Pope refused Frederick's request to crown his son Henry as co-emperor, and when Frederick had the Patriarch of Aquileia crown Henry as King of Italy, Urban III responded by suspending the Patriarch from his office. He then further insulted the emperor by refusing to accept his choice for the Archbishop of Trier. Instead, he consecrated as Archbishop a cleric hostile to the emperor. Frederick responded by having his son Henry invade and occupy the Papal States. So Urban III took refuge in Verona. When the city officials learned that the Pope was planning to excommunicate Frederick, they prudently expelled him from the city.
Good move.
So Urban III died while riding to Ferrara. The cardinals learned their lesson. The next Pope, Gregory VIII, was a diplomat who enjoyed the confidence of the emperor.
Okay.
But what really brought papacy and empire together was news of the annihilation of the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the surrender of the Holy City to the Egyptian infidel, the Sultan Saladin. Gregory VIII immediately called for a crusade, and Frederick was among the kings who answered that call.
Not that he ever got there. Didn't he drown crossing a stream in Turkey?
He did.
How did things go between the papacy and Henry VI after Barbarossa died?
Well, Henry VI proved to be at least as ambitious as his father, and in some ways he was more successful. His marriage to the Norman princess Constance gave him a claim to the Sicilian throne. Now,
Constance?
bear with me on this one. Constance was the daughter of King William II of Sicily. And William II had his barons swear to support a succession to the throne. When King William died, one of those barons, a kinsman, although an illegitimate kinsman, Tancred, renounced his oath and seized the throne. Doesn't that remind you of something in English history?
Just a little. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Tancred?
Tancred.
Yeah.
So Tancred's position was bolstered when he made a treaty with Richard the Lionheart, who had stopped in Sicily on his way to the Third Crusade.
So was that why Henry VI took Richard prisoner when he attempted to return from crusade by going through Germany?
The justification that the emperor gave the Pope for violating Richard's crusader immunity, and remember, crusaders were not to be tried.
Right.
Yeah, that was one of the privileges, was that Richard had lost that immunity when he had conspired to murder Conrad of Montferrat, the king-elect of Jerusalem.
We did an episode on Conrad's assassination. As you know, I think Richard was behind it, but there isn't enough evidence to really convict him.
I don't think he was.
And Henry VI apparently was willing to overlook the murder in return for what was quite literally a king's ransom.
Which ironically provided the funds Henry VI needed to conquer Sicily.
And Tancred served him right.
Well, Tancred died, so he's out of it. Okay. So Henry VI unsuccessfully then tried to persuade Pope Celestine III to recognize the unification of the kingdoms of Italy and Sicily in return for his promise to launch a new crusade.
Since the Kingdom of Sicily included Naples and all of Sicily south of Naples, the Papal States would have been encircled by Italian reunification. But wasn't Sicily supposed to have been a papal fief?
It was, and Tancred had done homage to the Pope for Sicily. Henry VI, unsurprisingly, didn't do that.
Okay.
Having acquired the Kingdom of Sicily, Henry VI now turned his attention eastward.
You mean as his father did, since Frederick Barbarossa promoted German expansion into the Baltic?
Yeah, and that's probably what he's most famous for. But no. By the East, I mean the Byzantine Empire.
Oh, Lord.
The goal was to make himself the one universal Roman emperor. The Byzantine Emperor Alexius III was able to deter the invasion with the payment of an enormous tribute.
Okay.
What checked the power of all Holy Roman emperors and medieval kings of Germany was that their offices were elective and not hereditary. If a Holy Roman Emperor wanted his son to succeed him, he had to court support among the German dukes and bishops. Henry VI wanted to change this. He offered a deal to the dukes. In return for making the crown hereditary, he would make their offices and their lands also hereditary. Of course, the German prince bishops would have gained nothing from this deal, and ultimately, when it came before the Diet, it was voted down. However, Henry VI, he got something out of it. He did persuade the Diet to elect his 3-year-old son, Frederick, as king of the Romans.
Okay.
As long as Henry VI lived, the power of the papacy was constrained. But in 1197, Henry died, probably of malaria, which was the leading cause of deaths by illness in Italy.
Yeah.
He was only 32 years old when he died. His young son, Frederick, succeeded to the throne of Sicily under the regency of his mother, Constance. The throne of Germany was another matter. There, nobles hostile to the Hohenstaufens elected the head of the rival Welf family, Otto of Brunswick. Initially, Henry VI's younger brother, Philip, supported the accession of his young nephew, but when it became clear that the German princes would not elect a child, he allowed himself to become the Hohenstaufen candidate.
Which I think is a good segue to Innocent III, since he became Pope in 1198. It sounds as though he was lucky to become Pope while the two most powerful German families, the Hohenstauens and the Welfs, were duking it out.
If Henry VI had not died suddenly in 1197, or if his brother Philip had succeeded to the German throne without controversy or dissent, Pope Innocent III's pontificate, I think, would have looked a lot different, and he would have come out as a lot less impressive.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I hate to suggest this, but given how important the pontificate of Innocent III was and how long we've already gone on in this episode, maybe we should break here and give him one.
I had originally planned 3 episodes on the medieval papacy. We're now going to do 6?
Think of it as an online course, but we've already swamped our listeners with so many names and dates. I think they'll appreciate a break as much as I do.
As always, my sweetheart, you are right. But next time, we really will wrap up our coverage of the papacy.
Promise.
After all, I still need to do the second, and I promise, the final episode on the consequences of the Norman conquest with Jenny Paxton. But until next time,
bye-bye for now.